Going on, we are engaged in our Master Gardener Volunteer Webinar Series for 2002. And we are in our May series. So today we are with Dr. Chris Wilson in the Rhizosphere, a follow-up. And next month, Dr. Jared Daniels will be joining us on pollinator conservation successes. So mark your calendar for next month as well. And for the webinar, please limit the use of the chat box for asking questions for the speaker. And we're going to be using that pretty heavily today because we are kind of working on a different format today. Dr. Wilson is going to kind of give you a little bit of a recap, quick review of what we covered in October at the Master Gardener Conference, but then he's going to be opening the floor up for questions for you about soil health, and how soil plays a role in our ecosystem. So, and if you don't like looking at the chat box, you can collapse it so you don't see it. So sometimes people say, Wendy, the chat box is distracting to me. And if you find it distracting, just collapse it and then you don't have to see the chat coming in. Okay. So I did want to remind you that we have the Master Gardener Volunteer Conference coming up, state conference. It's going to be in October. Should be opening registration next month. We're still determining the prices, but we do have our keynote speakers and some of our tours shaking up. The Sunday tour, for the first time in a very, very long time, we're going to be going to Bok Tower Gardens. And we will be seeing the beautiful gardens there, as well as their endemic plant conservation garden. So that's going to be pretty fascinating. And our keynote kickoff is Gary Bachman from Mississippi State. Dr. Bachman just finished his book on Southern gardening. It's called Southern Gardening All Year Long. And then our Tuesday speaker is going to be kicking off with our PBS television stars from Garden Fit, Madeline Hooper and Mr. David Hughes. So that's going to be fun about fitness in the garden and different ways to incorporate health in your garden. And then our wrap-up keynote is going to be Tony Avent from Plant Delights Nursery, coming down from Raleigh, North Carolina, to share his favorite perennials and ideas about plant exploration with us. So we're really excited about that. Again, look for the registration coming up soon. Janice Spencer wants to know, is there a virtual option? And there is going to be a virtual option for the conference. We're going to have to gear up the tech to do that. And so there will be a virtual option as well as an in-person option. Yay, good. I'm glad you're glad about that. All right, today joining us is Dr. Chris Wilson. He is from the University of Florida IFAS Agronomy Department. He considers himself a global change agroecologist. He's very interested in improving agricultural and food systems and creating ecosystem resilience. And he spoke to us about soil health and the Rhizosphere at the Master Gardener Virtual Conference in October of 2021. And that I shared that YouTube video with you all earlier this week, and I can share that again with you after we're done as well. But Chris, I'm going to go ahead and stop share and say thank you so much for being with us today. We're so excited to have you. We love fresh researchers and fresh educators to share with the Master Gardeners. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, yeah, thank you so much for inviting me back. Yeah, I guess just as a general recap, I think of soil health as a subject where you're talking about a balance among elements. You're talking about a balance of the physical, the biological, the chemical properties of soil. And there's a variety of indicators that we can delve into and, talk about in more depth today. I'm happy to recap, anything that I talked about in that webinar, if folks are wanting to go deeper on that. And I think kind of the overarching broad concept that is really important for everyone to take away is that there is no one definition of soil health that's going to fit for every single context you're going to work in. So I gave some examples. I linked to some like human biology examples. I also like to think about different ecosystems, stuff relevant here in Florida. Like if you're going to compare a longleaf flatwoods native ecosystem restoration to like high output, high quality vegetable production as a goal, you're talking about two vastly different demands that you're going to have on the soil. So a healthy soil for like a longleaf pine, savanna is going to be very low in nutrients, be what we call oligotrophic, so reduced nutrient content. You can talk to one of my friends and senior colleagues in biology, Dr. Jack Putz. He'll talk about how he's trying to do a lot of controlled burns, a lot of fires, specifically to burn off nutrients to make that restoration more successful. By contrast, if you look at, like, I showed some pictures from our hoop house at our house. If you're trying to do really high quality, abundant vegetable production, they need to have a constant supply of and balanced supply of all those macro and micronutrients. You need an even supply of water, so the demands in the soil are just hugely different. And I guess I would say that this goes into how you should evaluate different products, different amendments you might use. So we opened today very fittingly talking about compost, organic amendments, things like that. I'm a big believer in compost, but that said, there's a right balance with that. Sometimes people go a little bit overboard, in my opinion, and try to push their organic matter extremely high, assuming that basically more is always better, but more is not always better. Once you get past a certain amount of organic matter, particularly in our sandy kind of soils that have lower inherent fertility, lower nutrient holding capacity than, let's say, a prairie loam in Illinois, something like that, all those nutrients are going to go somewhere. And that could often just itself have some negative environmental consequences. So it could actually increase nitrogen, phosphorus loading into the environment, and that could have negative impact. So we always want to be figuring out what is the appropriate balance for all these different components of the soil that are important to us, and think about that with respect to whatever production goal or context that you have. So that's my opening bid there. I'm happy to field any of a wide variety of questions. So let's jump in.
Okay, we've got a question about Bokashi, and using Bokashi as a compost method. This is something that I'll let you talk about.
Yeah, so I think Bokashi is one of these, it's an anaerobic ferment, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I've experimented a little bit. Like I remember, golly, probably 15 years ago, I bought a little starter jar of effective microorganisms, or EM. I think it's sort of similar to some of the Bokashi stuff, and it was an anaerobic ferment. And certainly my wife and I enjoy making sauerkraut, all these kind of things for us to consume. I would say, from what I am aware, and this goes for a lot of these kind of alternative practices and amendments, I'm not sure if there's particularly robust data supporting that it's superior to other forms of, microbial inoculants or organic amendments, things like that. There's actually a lot of controversy over, how the process of microbial inoculation even works, if that's even a thing that is happening. We could talk more about that with respect to the soil food web. But I would always tell people, as long as it's sort of like the doctors, first do no harm, right? This is unlikely to cause any, damage, and it's not damaging your pocketbook. Go ahead and experiment with stuff. And then I'm always encouraging people, whether it's students in my class or whoever I'm talking to, when you do an experiment with a product, set up some kind of control comparison. Give yourself a chance to look and see, what is this actually doing? Is this improving my early seedling growth? Is it improving the quality of the plant, the visible plant growth? Because I think one trend that I see is people throw together 3 or 5 different things and do them all at the same time everywhere. And I'm totally guilty of that myself. I preach all this stuff all day as a scientist, as an educator, and then I go home and I'm like, oh, well, wouldn't this be really cool to do in the garden? So I just do it everywhere. But don't do what I do what I say, and give yourself a little bit of a chance to see if there's some benefit for it, and report back. I'd love to know if Bokashi helps you, and what kind of plants you're using it on, right?
Right, right. Well, I'll tell you, as far as our research base at the University of Florida IFAS, we don't have anything on it. So Chris, if you want to partner up with a county extension office and have the master gardeners try and do a trial or something like that, we would really appreciate if that's something that you're halfway into. That would be cool. And that might be something that kind of do a citizen science project and see if it's beneficial to folks. Okay.
And I feel the same way, just to quickly follow up on that. I feel exactly the same way about compost tea, to be honest. So one of the courses that I teach is Alternative Crop Systems, AGR 4212. It's an undergraduate course. And a couple years ago, during the bad COVID semester, I had some students who were going to do a project where they're going to really do a controlled comparison with compost tea and then a dilute soluble foliar fertilizer. So we would control for whether the compost tea is just a way to add nutrients, or are those organisms doing something additional to the nutrient input. And that's one of those projects. I think master gardeners could be a great audience for that as well, where I was really disappointed that that didn't get to happen. This was like, I came back off of paternity leave, and then it was March 2020 and everything sort of,
right.
We all know the rest of that story. So anyway.
Well, I think that compost tea question is important. One of the only papers or research I've seen on it, they said that perhaps it was the extra watering from the tea that actually stimulated the greater plant growth and the greater production. So I think there's still a lot of questions on that.
Absolutely.
One of our next questions is what is your thought on soil solarization? And it's one of the things that we recommend to knock back pest in the veg garden. But what do we do into that soil, the bioactivity of that soil?
Yeah, and that's something I'd be interested to talk to some folks in microbiome or over in entomology and nematology about, kind of what the, maybe secondary effects of that, right? The primary target of solarization, usually in our context, we're talking about, we want to knock down like root parasitic nematode levels. And there are some other pathogens as well. I used to, it's funny, I used to feel really like, this is like you're pressing the gas on the one hand, and then you're pumping the brake at the same time, like you're killing the biology in the soil that you're trying to foster. But then I also think about, I grew up in Southeast Michigan, and our soil froze through solid, for many months at a time normally, right? So climate's changing a little bit up there, but you still get a really good solid freeze out of it. And you know what? Some of the big benefits of that is that it's knocking back pathogenic organisms, right? So you get a little bit of a kind of a free pass in the early part of the season in those kind of climates that we don't benefit from here. Like we just do year-round production. We can start our fall garden that turns into the overwintering garden. Then we plant in spring, and then maybe we do some cover crops, or there's plenty of tropicals you could try to grow in the summer months if you're interested in being out in the heat and humidity. But that means like you get a continuous input of material into the soil, organic matter, nutrients. It's sort of, the temperatures are always more or less conducive to microbial activity. So you never get a chance to just press reset. So I actually, we're going to do some solarization in our home garden, if that gives you an indication. I haven't done it yet, primarily out of laziness, but since we put up that high tunnel and we've noticed a little bit more nematode pressure in year 2, and figure we got to get out in front of that problem before it really starts to impact us. So we are going to do it. But I agree, it's a great question. What are some of those other impacts on the food web?
So let's go a little bit deeper with I've got 2 questions about dealing with non-beneficial nematodes, one about the mustard seed, and then someone else asking about the natural way to deal with non-beneficial nematodes.
Right.
And the mustard seed, should you apply mustard seed, or you sow the mustard and then use it as a green manure?
I see. Well, that is ringing a bell for me, but I'm going to be honest and say that I don't know exactly. In general, the mustard family, they've got a lot of these sulfur containing amino acids, glucosinolates, things like that can have some sort of antimicrobial impacts. So I think there's a certain plausibility to that. To me, my assumption would be that you're talking about perhaps growing that as a green manure and then incorporating that into the soil, or making some kind of botanical extract perhaps, and then watering that in.
Mhm.
Again, I would classify that as almost certainly in that same category with Bokashi, with compost tea. I'd be very surprised if we have more than, one or two, even somewhat controlled kind of studies of that. So in terms of the natural options, I think rotation is always going to be a big, like, foundation stone there. So rotating crops that are susceptible with those that are not susceptible. I know some folks in horticulture have had, some promising results looking at sun hemp as a summer cover crop. And that's actually like probably 50% of the reason to do a summer cover crop like that, excuse me, is that it does seem to be kind of actively sort of allelopathic, in a sense, to the nematode population.
Great.
So
Good. Well, that kind of segues us into our next question.
Good.
And we may come back to nematodes. So if your brain clicks into
Sounds
something,
good.
let me know. So I had a question, and my friend Ann Bryan has a similar question. Ann says in her community, there are a lot of old roots where trees were removed. They don't seem to be breaking down. So I wonder if there aren't components in the soil to cause normal breakdown. Also, there's very few or no earthworms when they dig. And so that's Ann's question. And my question, and since you've been talking to Dr. Putz, you might already have heard about this, the laurel oaks, and I know I've been in Ann's community, there's a lot of laurel oaks. The laurel oaks have been implicated in exuding a substrate that helps this, that it does not help with soil organic matter health, water holding capacity at all. So could you kind of speak to the type of trees that perhaps are growing, and then why tree roots wouldn't be breaking down in a neighborhood or community situation?
Okay. Yeah, some good questions there. So the tree roots, those below ground, trees are amazing. Those below ground structures are going to be very tough, right? They're going to be this is material. So when we're looking at how fast organic material breaks down in the soil, there are a couple properties that we tend to focus in on. One of them is the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So it's a ratio of those two elements. That nitrogen is needed to sustain the growth of the decomposing organisms. So if you have a really high C/N ratio, so let's say 200 atoms of carbon to every atom of nitrogen, which would be, quite possible with a woody plant, like a tree bowl like that, it's just inherently going to take a long time for that breakdown to proceed. And there's a whole succession of microorganisms that engage in that process. For wood, it's, to my understanding, fairly obligately dependent on fungi to initiate the first steps of decomposition. Fungi are actually a little bit better. They're a little bit thriftier at accumulating resources from the surrounding environment and then sort of like transposing it to where they need it to create the enzymes that will break down that, whether it's woody material, wood chips, really like senesced leaf material, things like that. That's actually one of the reasons why if you go out into an intact, like closed canopy forest and you start digging around, you've got generally speaking, you'll have like a leaf layer, and then you start digging a little bit underneath that, you will see a lot of those white fungal threads proliferating. It's a very fungal dominated environment where you have that type of input. So I would say, it's possible perhaps that there might be some limitation in terms of the availability of those fungal communities to access where that tree is. But I'd also just say that inherently it's always going to take a surprisingly long period of time. And, another thing with the trees is, oftentimes they're not totally dead, right? We think, oh, well, we cut this like this year, but it could still be alive for many, many years. And anyone who's seen live oaks, laurel oaks resprout, like that's the story of our front field where we did some tree clearing to open up space for our garden. And then now we've got these thickets of resprouting. So that would be another thing just to consider there, is if the tree may have stayed alive for longer than you think, and then also just it could take many years to break down. So,
Good.
and what was the second part of that question?
Well, I was talking about the laurel oaks and the armillaria
Yeah.
combination, and how the armillaria kind of, that as that mycelium moves through the soil, it's just becomes, it sort of dries it out, and it just doesn't really improve the health at all whatsoever. So that's just a side. We've got some other good
Sure.
questions, so let's jump to
Sure.
that. So Terry Devalier says, does organic versus commercial fertilizer have an impact on soil health and plant performance? And she's thinking about vegetable production.
That is an awesome question. I love talking about that. I would say that I would kind of go back to the soil health framework a little bit, some of which I covered in that seminar. And I would think about this as you're really trying to aim for balanced crop nutrition. Okay. And so the plants are going to have different demands for those elements, for nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. I mean, you could go down the list. There's about 15 or 16 that are essential for the plant growth to happen. From the plant point of view, you know, most of those nutrients are going to be taken up in what's called the mineral form, which basically means these are ions in the soil solution, whether that's directly taken up by the plant root, or there might be, if you've got a mycorrhizal association on the plant, the mycorrhizae can take up nutrients, especially phosphorus, and end up contributing that to the plant nutrition. But all those nutrients sort of go through this eye of the needle, where they're, at least for some period of time, found in an ionic form. So nitrate, ammonium, so NO3 minus, NH4 positive, phosphate, you know, and so the question then is, okay, where did they then come from to get into that ionic form? And that's where you've got these options, right? So there are the certified organic sources, and that has to do more with, you know, where was this procured? How many steps of processing have gone on in between, let's say, the original mining of that mineral and then the form that it's present in terms of the, you know, the fertilizer product itself. Okay. So I personally feel like it is useful to be a little bit agnostic at times about source and focus on getting the right balance of nutrients for the crops. That said, I mean, I use a lot of organic sources of nutrients, but I'm just as happy, you know, like when we produce our seedlings, you know, we mix, there's a high calcium Miracle Grow product, and nothing really works quite as well as that in my experience. So I'm more than happy to use that, you know, that stage. So I think in terms of the soil health side too, sometimes people make a big deal out of the source of nutrients. I will tell you that the published literature is fairly clear that the most important factors are going to be, you know, how much organic material, you know, what you're doing with the residues, how you're managing that soil environment, you know, the management of the pH, all that stuff is like a huge impact. And then like if you're applying a reasonable rate of something like ammonium nitrate or urea, it's not really going to have a negative impact. I know some people say like, oh, if you get more than 100 pounds per acre of mineral nitrogen, like that's really bad for the soil bacteria. That has never been shown. I mean, if you're really going overboard with like anhydrous ammonia and disking that in, like that could be a little bit harsh on the soil biology. I think I would believe that. But I think if you're within reasonable rates for most of these products, it has much more to do with, are you providing the food, the structure, the environment to support that life in the soil? And, you know, it's sort of like, you know, if in a context of a really intensively tilled system, you know, it's sort of like stepping over dollars to pick up pennies in a sense, worrying too much about the sources of some of the nutrients. So that's my perspective on it. I will say people can disagree with that, and that is true.
Okay. All right, Chris, thank you for that. Alan is wondering if they have seen any effects of insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides on soil microbial activity. You can pick one or all.
Yeah. I think that's a really good question. And I am not aware of, okay, so I have seen papers that have shown that have done the kind of genomics in the soil that have shown that there are going to be impacts from some long-term applications of different, chemical products. And, things like Roundup, glyphosate, that's been studied quite a lot in that regard. One of the difficulties is that in the real world, like out in the wild, these products aren't applied in isolation from a whole bunch of other practices. So it can be difficult to really tease out, is this because, again, there's not a healthy crop rotation, it's growing the same annual crop with a minimal root system year after year after year, and intensive tillage and all these things. So really isolating out that impact of the chemical applications is one issue. But in controlled, research station stuff, I have seen a couple papers. I would defer on a more definitive answer till I've looked to see if there are any more recent meta-analyses or reviews on that.
Okay.
I think it's an important
question. It's an important question. Okay. Aaron O'Leary says, I've learned recently that phosphates leach downward in many Florida sandy soils. So this macronutrient may be unavailable to most plants, except for maybe established trees. Can mycorrhiza bring available phosphate to shallow rooted plants? And, when we do our soil test, most of the veg soil tests, we see very high levels of phosphate because we're Florida. But could you speak a little bit to her question as well as to the bioavailability of the form of phosphorus that we're seeing?
Sure. Yeah, no, those are great questions. So as you noted, several soils in Florida are kind of natively rich in phosphorus. I think this to be the case for much of the properties. So my wife and I live southwest of Gainesville. For those of you who are familiar with the area, kind of between McNopie, Archer, Gainesville, kind of land there. So when we moved in, I did a soil test, of course, because that's the first thing you do, right? When you get a new house, you test your soil. I did see fairly high phosphorus, including in our forested area, which I don't have any reason to believe would have been fertilized at any point. The other thing that happens though is that, coming from sort of organic farming and gardening roots, and wanting to build some organic matter, of course, we bring in compost. A lot of times that also brings with it a fair amount of phosphorus. So in our garden area, we've sort of doubled that pre-existing phosphorus level over the time here. As to whether the mycorrhizae help, they do help. It's a little bit nuanced. The mycorrhizae are going to help plants access phosphorus, and it's most relevant in situations where you have a low soil phosphorus, or there's some other condition in the soil that's tending to lock up the phosphorus and render it unavailable. So a really good example of that is something we contend with, which is actually alkalinity. So bringing in too much basic material that drives the pH up. So going up past 7.2, our issue is we have a nice 60-foot well. The water quality is pretty good, but like a lot of people in Florida, this is coming right out of the aquifer. That means it's carrying a lot of dissolved limestone. And so it's actually like we're liming the soil accidentally as we irrigate. And so over time, that's actually led to increase in alkalinity, which I now constantly try to counteract by adding elemental sulfur, which is a good way to try to lower your soil pH. So if you get a really high alkalinity, the calcium and phosphorus can link up together and they form a mineral called apatite, and that can render the phosphorus unavailable. So there's problems at high pH. Phosphorus also has problems at very low pH from a different pathway. And so either of those two, or just having a low phosphorus level, mycorrhizae can generally help with plant nutrition given those conditions. If you've got a nice balanced pH and a moderate to high phosphorus level, it's not clear what the residual benefit of the mycorrhizae is in terms of, the phosphorus level in the plant. There was a question about the recycling of phosphorus. So I think that's a really cool kind of long-term ecosystem concept to get into, that, you know, we've got soils and we're often kind of focused on the top few inches of the soil. That's where we're doing most of our management interventions. But of course, especially in the sandy soil, a lot of stuff is leaching down. And basically the only way to really bring that back is to bring in deep-rooted plants. So the mycorrhizae per se wouldn't necessarily help, but if you had a deep-rooted plant, so that it sends its root systems down, let's say a few meters into the soil, you know, that's what's going to help you mine those nutrients, and then bring, when that tissue then dies and turns over on the surface of the soil, you're sort of pumping it back up, and you can kind of create these little cycles over time. That's the theory, at least. How to actually pull that off could be a little tricky, depending on your context.
Is there a deep-rooted plant that you would recommend for that?
Well, again, it's sort of like it'll depend if you're in a farm system, a garden context, if you're doing ornamentals or you know, vegetable gardening. Honestly, it's a little bit of a pitch for perennial grasses, which is kind of the focus of my research area, and pasture, bahia grass, things like that. As long as the water table lets them, they will develop very deep and extensive root systems. Another interesting crop, this would be definitely in the experimental side at this point, is actually sesame. So our former department chair, Diane Rowland, and one of her PhD students, Roman Gloagan, who's now a faculty member in France, did some interesting work on sesame as a potential alternative crop in Florida. It's very drought tolerant, so we can kind of fit it in our very brief, sometimes droughty season, right? Around May, June, that time. But that thing put down roots so deep.
As deep as bahia?
If not deeper. It was which is impressive for an annual crop, because annuals, you know, they have to accomplish a lot in a short period of time.
Well, that would explain its drought tolerance, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about, I think, containers. So Pat says, have cloth grow bags been proven to be useful in root growth? What would be some of the benefits or disadvantages of those cloth grow bags?
Great question. I do not really know much about that. I'd defer to Xin Xiao or, you know, Dr. Carlene Chase or someone like that.
Okay. And then using container gardening, how often should you reuse the soil? Throw away or compost the roots? Kevin mixes compost, sometimes like black cow, but wondering if he should be starting with new soil or sterilizing the soil versus reusing the soil. I think that depends on what kind of crops you've been growing, but I'm going to defer that to you, Chris.
Yeah. Again, this has started branching into some more specialized topics that some folks in horticulture may have more perspective on. I would say in general, again, you know, if you've got veg crops that are likely to pick up soil-borne diseases, you are going to want to at least rotate what you're growing, kind of similar to the field-based rotation. I don't know what the recommended best management practices are as far as routine sterilization. We do that obviously in research settings, you know, for purposes of having a clean experimental context. Whether we recommend that for master gardeners, I'm not entirely sure.
Yeah, I think if you're growing a crop that really isn't very nematode prone and you're doing a good crop rotation, just keeping those beds filled with fresh new soil, because it does oxidize and kind of burn off. So keeping those beds fresh and refilled, Kevin, probably would be the best practice to follow in that regard. That's just my horticulture opinion.
It sounds reasonable to me.
Okay, so Veronica wants to know, how would you calculate how much organic matter is enough?
Yes, really, really good question. Okay, so in the seminar with the slides that you all have access to, I presented some of data from a more recent research project where they were actually trying to analyze, like in a controlled experimental way, like what is the crop growth benefit of having different levels of organic matter. So the first thing I would say is you're going to be constrained by the type of soil you have and the type of environment that you have. So if you're in a hot, humid environment with a really coarse soil, which describes a lot of Florida, your maximum sustainable amount of organic matter is going to be much lower than it is in a cool environment with really heavy loamy soil. So if you're up in, like, let's say like Michigan, Illinois, Iowa, those areas in the upper Midwest, a really good productive soil might be 6 to 8% organic matter. You can get your soil that high here in Florida, but you're going to do that by constantly adding really high levels of organic amendments that are by definition coming from offsite, and you're kind of piling them on. So you're piling on the compost, you're piling on mulches and other residues and things like that. From my experience, some of the numbers that I have seen, I think that if you've got a soil fairly characteristic for much of Florida and you've hit 2% organic matter, you're actually doing okay. And it's a number that sounds kind of small or deflationary, but the difference between like 0.5% and 2%, you're going to see that difference in your production system. I'm virtually sure of that. But pushing from 2 to 4, like, okay, there might be some benefit from that, but that's probably just because to get to that high level, you just brought in a ton of compost. And so maybe it's just more like a fertilizing effect from all that compost breakdown. But that's where we go back to what I was saying before about that could actually mean that you are applying nutrients way in excess of what your plants can reasonably be expected to take up. And anytime you do that, they have to go somewhere. And so they're either, volatilizing into the atmosphere, or they're kind of leaching down, in the soil, or running off during heavy rain events, things like that. So I really, I think having a reasonable expectation, bring it up to 2, 3, 4%, that range, and kind of be happy if you can keep it there with a reasonable level. A heuristic I like to use is, if you're doing multiple cycles of production, maybe in every year, maybe it's like 1/4 to 1/2 inch of compost on your beds is plenty, from the standpoint of just maintaining organic matter. Obviously, if you are trying to put together a situation like a raised bed or something like that, and that's just 100% kind of this synthetic soil that we are kind of creating, that's a whole different context. So I guess my remarks are more focused on a somewhat more field-based system.
Right. So, yeah, I think of those raised beds as, that's a growing medium that you've created. It's kind of not natural soil there.
Right.
So I've got a couple questions I sort of want to give quick answers to, and then we're going to dive into some. Linda Brown says, what about using mycorrhiza to putting it in the soil when planting? I don't know if they have a generic product out there or not.
Yeah, that's and sometimes potting soil will come and advertise that it has mycorrhizae in it. The thing about mycorrhizae people should be aware of is that oftentimes there's a fair amount of host specificity. So there are, it's a tremendously diverse category of organisms, and oftentimes they're trying to link up with specific plants. So again, some of these products are verging on some of the sort of gray zone as far as the science goes.
Can we say snake oil?
Yes, yes.
Okay.
Some of it is definitely snake oil. If you really want to get me worked up, look at the products advertised where they've got 6 pots of plants, and then they've got 3 that are really high and then 3 that are just dying, and they're like, look what our product did. And it's okay, well, yeah, sure. Yeah, I can show you some dead plants right now, and it's because I didn't water them.
So the take-home message is usually it's very host specific. And then Janice has read that magnolia leaves emit a chemical into the soil that inhibits the growth of other plant. Is this significant and serious?
I'm not sure. I'd have to check the literature on that, or maybe when I get home I'll look around our magnolias and.
Yeah, if you notice under a magnolia tree, there's usually not a whole lot of germination going on. And I think that there's probably some allelopathy, maybe, I don't know. But sometimes I also think that just the density and the thickness of those leaves is allowing go into the soil and allow for germination or something.
Exactly. Right. So that's a good, you bring up a really good point there, that a lot of times people ascribe things to allelopathic effects that are actually other modifications in the environment that are resulting in that. So, yeah.
Okay. I've got a root question for you
Mhm.
from Julia. Does root structure or deformity affect the ability of trees or shrubs to absorb nutrients? I'm thinking about the effects of circling roots or twisted taproot when the plant is young.
Mm.
Also know of a Bahama strongbark that has persistent chlorides even after applying sulfuric to alkaline soil.
Hmm. I'm not sure. I need some more clarification on that latter question. I would assume that like strongly visible alterations in root system proliferation growth would have some impact. But I think that's probably one of those things that's really case by case, really specific to different types of plants and all that.
Now here's a question I know you're going to love. So Donald said, what are your thoughts on converting to perennial crops from annuals and developing perennial varieties to increase productivity and protect the soil? And I know you have a lot to say, so I'm going to mute myself.
Just tee me up there for that one. Yeah, well, it is a great question. That is sort of an arc that I follow in my undergraduate course that I teach in the springs. And, we kind of talk about the whole history of agriculture, this association, it seems like, between the, annual crops and development of civilizations over time and all that stuff. And so, yeah, I am very interested in the whole work that's being done to develop more perennial varieties. Many folks have probably heard of the Land Institute. So this was started by a geneticist named Wes Jackson, who is very visionary in a lot of ways, and basically pushed forward this idea of breeding perennial wheat specifically. So they've actually very recently released a cultivar called Kernza that was based on intermediate wheatgrass. And that's now being commercialized. So you can actually go down to the store and pick up cereal that's under the Cascadian Farms brand that's made at least partially with Kernza. So there's a lot of work going on that in the upper Midwest. The Land Institute is based in Kansas. The idea is that particularly in maybe the drier parts of the Midwest and the plains, the native ecosystem are these kind of shorter prairies that would feature perennial plants. And so wouldn't it be great if we could transform a lot of wheat producing land into perennial types of plants? So we go further east in the country where we get higher amounts of rainfall. The native vegetation kind of goes through this sequence, into tall grass prairie and then into more forested types of environments. So that's where I think that tree crops are an interesting place to look in really wet environments. And so I'm personally actually have recently started a little side research project on chestnut. It's a cross Chinese by American chestnut that we're doing some physiological work on. And so I'm very interested in kind of agroforestry research and development that would be geared towards, more production of human foods out of those systems. So a lot of benefits to perennials, right? A lot less soil disturbance. They do develop in general a much deeper, more extensive root system. So one of the slides that I had, showed some of that root system. I think in a lot of ecosystem contexts, the roots are really key to a lot of these soil health outcomes that we're interested in. So it's the primary origin for a lot of soil organic matter. It comes from the root systems in one form or another. Obviously, having a extensive, fine root system also holds the soil physically in place and imparts structure to it. So it can really reduce rates of soil erosion, which is still sort of an ongoing problem in many of our agricultural areas. And it can also mean that you have the opportunity to do much more efficient nutrient cycling in those systems. So because you can have roots that are active down much deeper in the soil, if you apply some fertilizer and then you get a rain event that leaches it down, let's say from 3 down to 12 inches or something, that's not necessarily going to do any harm to you if you've got a perennial with a root system ready to take it up at that depth. Whereas if you have an annual crop and it's at the seedling stage and its roots are only going down an inch, then you're much more sensitive to all that nutrient movement. And so it's harder to be as efficient with your resources in an annual system compared to a perennial system. So that's like the ecological case for perennials. Where we're at now is in terms of total food output, they don't match yet where we're at with our high yield wheat and corn and things like that. But that there are signs that can be improved through breeding. So plant breeding plays a really important role there, and as well as putting things together in more diverse, multifunctional kind of ecosystems. So a lot of reasons to be excited about it. That's kind of my attempt at a brief overview.
I was also thinking about the prolonged carbon sequestration,
Yes.
as well as just the ecosystem services for a plant that remains, whether it be for megafauna, bigger things, besides the soil biota.
So yeah, that's a great point. I'll just say another couple words on that. If we want to talk about carbon sequestration in agricultural systems, which is a very hot topic, and you're going to see a lot more coming out of IFAS in the coming years due to some different funding streams that are coming into place. Really nothing beats perennial systems. So perennial pasture is one of the best ways to build soil organic matter, but these tree crops as well. I mean, they can foster just a much higher level of organic carbon, and they can potentially store it at different, at depth in the soil where it might potentially be a little bit more protected. So I get a little worried sometimes with some of the conversation around carbon sequestration and annual crop systems. We've seen this before. So there's a big move to go towards no-till or conservation tillage starting in the 80s, and that has percolated in a lot of places. There are a lot of good things that happen with conservation tillage, but it's turned out with the benefit of long-term studies that a lot of the initial apparent benefits to soil carbon content were limited to that surface couple few inches. And that if you actually measured the carbon down to, let's say, 0.5 meter or 1 meter, there was no net difference between a no-till and a conventional tillage system on average, right? So there's always going to be tons of variation. Some places will see bigger effects, but that just tells you that we've got to be really careful about accounting for that depth. And I think perennials long-term have the most potential for doing that. Absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that.
Great. Good. Diane, I see your question. I think I'm going to wrap up with that one when we get a little bit closer. But Robert Howard and someone else brought up this thought here, wanting your thoughts on general quality consistency of commercially bagged compost. And then I had another question about our one of our favorite compost and manures, black cow, worried about the persistence of perhaps herbicides in that the cows eat the grass and have the herbicide, and then they poop it out and that gets composted, and then we see that in our bag stuff. So that is
right.
Well,
so that
what do you think?
Yeah, there was a few years ago an incident where that was a little bit of a problem up here in Alachua County with some persistent herbicides. I won't go into the whole, details on that, but it did impact a local source of compost that had some effects for people. I think one thing that's a little bit reassuring is that, there will be some short-term impacts if you did have those residues. So this was a product called Grazon that people are often concerned about. It's persistent in the sense that, when the animals digest that forage, it can actually survive, its passage through the rumen and persist for some time after that. But it does break down, and the impact of that on your, garden or farm environment will go away after a few months. But that said, of course, nobody wants to take a hit. It's heartbreaking anytime you lose, even a little bit of potential productivity on these plants that you invested so much in, right? I'm not really aware of what the standard, if there are really many standards as far as standardized testing and analysis of these products. I've often, we've sourced an eclectic, pool of compost for our own personal use. And sometimes I've wondered, I'm like, maybe I should test that. There are services you can use. So different laboratories will do like nutrient testing, and we'll do a little bit of like environmental contaminant testing on as a paid service. But I'm not sure if there's any talk about like how that goes in as far as the industry making these products, if anything's required along those lines or not. My assumption is probably it's pretty minimal, but I don't know for sure.
My thought on that is that, a company that's bagging and selling nationwide is testing.
Yeah.
They're testing because
I'm sure they're doing it internally, and because
Yeah.
like we see with these recalls, with the latest with peanut butter, whatever it is, it's not good publicity to have something like that happen. So I think it would be in self-interest of companies, as you suggest, to stay on top of that a bit. I don't worry about it a huge amount myself, if that says anything. Maybe I should. I don't know.
So there's a couple of questions about vermiculture and conventional compost and regarded to root health, and then one of my questions kind of was a little bit about that bioactivity and making sure that soil life is rich and robust, but how does that really impact root health? Are there studies out there that show?
Yeah, again, that's a really good question. I would say it's starting to sound a little bit like a broken record a bit. A lot of it is going to be, you have to think about the multiple factors that are going to be impacted by these products. So when you're adding a compost, you're bringing those microorganisms potentially. The current kind of consensus among soil ecologists, I have some colleagues who really specialize in that area, is like a lot of these products, it's not so much an inoculation effect, is that those microbes that you're bringing in on the product themselves decompose and stimulate the endogenous native organisms that were already in that soil. So it's almost like you're sort of helping to lift up and balance out what was the biological community that was already present. Okay. The other thing, of course, that's happening is that you're potentially modifying that physical environment of the soil. It's going to have potentially better aeration. It's going to hold on to have a more even nutrient supply. So bacteria in the soil mostly inhabit like water films that are coating like, pore surfaces and things like that. So the evenness and consistency of the water supply has a huge impact on the microbial activity and proliferation and all that stuff. And then the nutrients that are brought in, are going to have a direct impact on your plant production, and then also indirectly through whether those are also fostering, meeting microbial needs. So there's actually a sense in which microbes and plants compete a little bit for nutrients. So, microbes are the primary agents of decomposition in the soil, so that they're releasing a lot of these enzymes outside of their cells. So we call them extracellular enzymes. Those are responsible for a lot of this decomposition activity that then eventually releases nutrients. But there's this sort of old adage that the bacteria feast first at the table. So they're likely to meet their own needs prior to like the surplus spillover that can then become available to plants. It's a little bit more nuanced than that, but it's a useful thing to think about. So yeah, it's just like these practices that we do to take care of these ecosystems act on several things at once. And so it can be hard to really parse out. So all those factors, aeration, new water supply, guess what? They're all going to have a huge impact on your pattern of root growth and proliferation. So your plant roots are also in many cases sort of sensing deficits in the soil. So if there's like, and this will vary with types of crops, types of plants, some of them will respond to a drought by proliferating more roots deeper down, right? Or they'll shift their root morphology. These are actually things that we take pictures of in the lab too, that kind of document some of those responses. So there's a very intricate kind of interaction going on between roots and the soils. But I would say absolutely yes, as a general principle, if you're balancing out the soil in all those ways, you should expect that root proliferation and growth is going to be better than it would be without those management practices.
Okay.
So
very good. Leslie Arundel, she has heard that sewage sludge products can be contaminated with PFAS, forever chemicals. Have you heard that too?
It sounds like something that could very well be the case. I'm not aware of any specific study on that. But I don't know. There's another Chris Wilson, actually, you're probably familiar in soil and water sciences. He and I constantly get each other's mail, but he's actually an environmental toxicology kind of guy. So I would actually walk down the hall and ask him that.
Okay, all right, that's fine. I'm gonna get back one. So sometimes at the Master Gardener Help Desk, we talk with people who are just, oh, I'm starting a garden. I better go rent a tiller. Or I need to till the garden. And in Florida, we see people over tilling. I've always thought maybe one time to break up the soil, to break up the turf or whatever weeds, get that out there and start with that slate. But after that, probably no tilling. But I wanted to get your input on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. To till
or not to till, Chris?
I'm a tiller, but that said, I think there's a lot of, again, kind of context that can go into that. I think avoiding excessive tillage is really, really important. I think there's some important differences between types of implements. So I have one of these kind of like, splurged on a higher end kind of market gardening tractor called a BCS. And so it gives me some greater control over the tillage action. So I've got pretty good control on the depth on that particular implement. And you can also separately adjust like engine speed, separately from the gearing that you're in. So you can really slow down, if you're going to do that kind of rotary tillage, you can do it at quarter throttle. I think a lot of times people go out there and they put the throttle on max and it's just like this pulverization box that's just obliterating everything, right? I like to think of it as like if I've got some cover crop residue or some weed residue that I've just mowed or I've just applied some compost, if I want to get speedy decomposition of that, some of that incorporating action is going to really help. And so doing a single pass at like quarter throttle leaves the beds in a situation that I can then come back with like a harrow attachment or something and get a really nice planting surface out of it. So, but that said, there's a lot of different ways you can get to the goal of what you're trying to do. So I definitely encourage some thoughtfulness around tillage.
Sure. And what about the impacts on the soil biota?
I'm sure it's temporarily not necessarily good, but it's also just thinking of this as like we're aerating the soil in a sense. So if it's accompanied by like, if you try to limit your tillage to those times when you're also feeding the soil, so you're putting those residues in that you have, you can kind of think of it as like, I might be offsetting some of the detriment from this activity with some boost over here. And I have found that we have no problem with, like, we can put a heavy residue on those beds, do this light tillage to incorporate it, and that stuff decomposes like that, which tells me that biotic community bounces back really fast given the right conditions.
Good. And we're seeing a lot of top dressing on even turf grass, and that's a practice where we actually see it just disappear at that 2 to 3 inch depth that's applied. Yeah. Okay, so this is our last question, and this is the question from Diane. It's a little bit long, so perk up your ears. Mounting evidence from multiple scientific studies show that many fruit, veggies, grains grown today carry less nutrients than those grown decades ago. Some of the scientists say that the problem lies in our modern agricultural practices that increase crop yields but disturb soil health. So I'm wondering what you think about the modern agriculture impacting our soil health and then decreasing perhaps, and we need your input on this, is it decreasing the nutrients in our food?
Yeah, this is a really fascinating question. I remember a few years back doing a little bit of a dive on Google Scholar on that one. I think that it is fair to say that there was sort of a general decline, particularly in some micronutrient contents in field crops that were related to fertility practices. And particularly if you do, as you suggest, very high yield agricultural production, where you are by definition removing a lot of material output every season from that field, and you're supporting that, you're going to have pretty high inputs of your macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, things like that going on the field. If farmers were not also taking care of the micronutrient side of things, the micronutrients got a little bit low because they were exporting a lot through their yields. That it's now far more standard. You'll see, if you look on fertilizer dealers and things, that micronutrient packages are applied along with the major nutrients. So we see a little bit less of that. There is another thing going on though, at least two other things. One is in the fruit and veg crops. There is some work that suggests something called a size dilution effect. And so as we selected over time for larger edible plant parts that we were interested in some cases it may have been that inadvertently that sort of selected for less density of maybe the mineral, vitamin nutrients, phytonutrients, things like that. And because there could be some trade-off as the plants are synthesizing, let's say, a lot of starch or putting a lot of things together to get those large plant parts, that may have come at the expense of some of that nutrient density. That's actually not necessarily directly linked to any impact on the soil per se, but whether then maybe those things play together a little bit. Last thing I'll mention with that, it goes along with size dilution, is CO2 fertilization. So as we are moving into this era of climate change driven by higher levels of CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, from our activities, right? Plant growth does in general respond positively to higher levels of CO2 in isolation, right? It's all the other impacts of climate change that we're worried about from plant production point of view. But one of the consequences of that is that you increase the carbon to nitrogen ratio of the plant. So I mentioned that earlier in the context of decomposition, but it can also, in effect, pull off a size dilution whereby your nitrogen content might go down a little bit. And nitrogen, mostly it's found in proteins in plants. So that would almost by definition mean a lower concentration of protein. So these are things that I think you're going to see increased attention from breeders on these qualitative components. Already have to a certain degree. But I think as a baseline, again, if you're thinking as a gardener, take care of that range of nutritional needs that the plants have, take care of those soils, and grow a variety of produce. So I think, again, sometimes people get a little tripped up. If we're talking maybe like a 20% decline on average, maybe in vitamin and mineral content in our vegetable and fruit products, the reality is if you are eating a diverse, 6 to 10 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, your nutritional status is going to be up here compared to the median down there, right? The biggest problem is people just aren't eating enough of these kind of fresh, unprocessed foods. So I think about the flavor, play around with different varieties, see what tastes good. Oftentimes that intensity of flavor and color gives you a clue to, the kind of biochemical richness of those plants as well.
Great response. I really appreciate that. Janice says, awesome presentation. She's ready for part 3.
All right.
So we're a
Well,
little bit past 2 o'clock, and Chris has a research and teaching position, so we want to be mindful of his time over there at McCarty. I don't even know how you get to McCarty anymore. Do you
yeah,
just
it's
parachute in?
that's the joke, right?
Yep, exactly. Well, Chris, we really appreciate it, and I pay attention, everybody, because I will link that YouTube video on the front page of your Better Impact app. So, or when you go open Better Impact, your volunteer, where you put in your volunteer hours on the main page, I will put that YouTube. So if you want to rewatch the presentation from back in October, you can do that. And everyone's saying thank you, and they really appreciate it. And I share their sentiment. Chris, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, and we appreciate all you do for us. And we hope to see you again soon. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Happy to come back.
All right. Everyone says they love it. Yay. Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.